The biggest hero of the MCU has always been the one and only Stan Lee. His cameos rocked, and whenever he showed up, I'm sure I wasn't the only one with a huge smile on my face. But what if the character Stan Lee was playing in all those movies was actually a former Avenger? Today's video is a totally radical theory that could change everything we know about the MCU, and suggests that Stan Lee is actually Old Man Captain America. That's right, the friendly and observant old-timer who shows up in every MCU movie is a time-traveling Steve Rogers, keeping a watchful eye on our universe. And yes, this totally means Steve called Tony Stark
Tony Stank.
Keep watching to find out more.
Don't make me come down there, you punk!
Alright, get your tissues ready because it's time to revisit the end of Avengers Endgame. After the universe was saved and Hawkeye could finally go back and finish his family picnic, you'll remember that Steve Rogers agreed to undergo a dangerous mission to return the Infinity Stones to their rightful places in the timeline in order to save the time-space continuum. His job was to jump through time and put the stones back, which I guess means finding a way to inject Jane Foster with the ether and say hi to his old buddy Red Skull on Vormir and then jump back to the present so Cap, Bucky, and Falcon could form their own boy band and tour the nation together. Was that last part only in my head canon? Never mind. But we all know that that's not what happened. Steve seemingly completed his mission, but instead of coming back to the present, he stayed behind in the past so he could dance and live his life with his true love, Peggy Carter. And of course, I'm sure he waited until after that dance was over to tell Peggy that he made out with her niece, Sharon. It was the happy ending the character deserved, but it was a decision that basically broke the internet. War was quickly drawn between the two sides, who either believed Captain America was always around in the original timeline, or that he jumped to an alternate universe to live out his life. It also sparked a little controversy for some who believed that Captain America was in the original timeline the whole time, but allowed all the horrible stuff to happen like Hydra's infiltration of S.HIELD, and didn't do or say anything about it. That seems out of character for Steve to just sit back and let evil triumph, so what gives? Well, this new theory suggests that not only was Steve definitely in the original timeline, but that he was always around during the events of the movies, watching from a safe distance and making sure everything stayed on course. And because there's only been one older gentleman who's appeared in every MCU movie, it's time to declare what we've all been thinking. Stan Lee is actually old Captain America. I know, it's kinda crazy, and I'm not saying the MCU always planned it this way, but just like how they retconned Iron Man 2 to make the little kid that Tony saves at the expo a young Peter Parker, it wouldn't take that much work to say that all those great cameos from Stan Lee in MCU movies are actually Captain America cameos. Let's just break down some of the most memorable appearances and try to show what exactly Cap was up to during this time. It would actually be really funny if this turned out to be true. Like, let's take a look at his first two Iron Man appearances. In all of his cameos, Stan Lee usually doesn't portray anyone of importance, but that wasn't the case in Iron Man and Iron Man 2. In that first movie, Tony mistakes him for Hugh Hefner, and then in the second film, he's mistaken for Larry King. At first glance, this is a funny gag, but wouldn't it even be funnier knowing that the first two times Tony Stark sees a future Steve Rogers, he mistakes him for two different people? It would put an interesting spin on their dynamic and show just how far Tony Stark has come in the MCU. If you look at some of his other cameos, you can also see how he's subtly helping his fellow Avengers without causing too big of a scene. Take a look at the first Thor movie, where his cameo is driving a truck that's trying to move Thor's hammer. Of course, the truck doesn't seem worthy enough and it's destroyed, but if you wanted to look at justification for why this is Steve Rogers, notice that we don't see Stan trying to lift the hammer himself. He's using a device to try to get the hammer to budge. You could say it's because if his character had tried lifting it, he would have been successful, as Steve proved himself worthy in Endgame, but he couldn't let that happen. His goal was to make a big enough scene that would alert S.HIELD and Thor himself of where the hammer was located, and it worked. This would also be a fun reveal because it ties into Steve and Tony's conversation at the end of Age of Ultron about whether an elevator would go up or down if the hammer was set inside it. Because it answers the question of what happens if someone who's worthy tries to lift the hammer using something mechanical, and the answer isn't pretty. Or how about his cameo in Captain America the Winter Soldier? There, he plays a security guard who's on duty at the museum when younger Steve needs a suit. It's a funny moment when Stan Lee realizes the suit has been stolen, but I think you could argue it was an older Steve helping out a younger Steve. All these cameos would give the impression that an older Steve is quietly helping out the team in easy-to-miss ways. And you could argue that old Captain America is helping out in other ways too. Check out this deleted scene from the Avengers, which shows a freshly unfrosted Steve still trying to adapt to the world around him. He talks to a pretty waitress, you know, the one who got an odd amount of screen time in the final cut of the Avengers, and wouldn't you know it, a kind old man who looks like he enjoys saying "Excelsior" sits behind him and tells Steve to ask for her number. On the surface, it's funny, but could it be possible that an older Steve Rogers was actually telling his younger self that he needs to get out there and enjoy life more? Which then planted the seed deep within his own subconscious to one day make the decision to walk away from true hero work to go after his own heart's desire. Could this tiny, insignificant meeting actually be the catalyst for everything, and the producers cut it out of the movie because they were afraid fans would guess this game-changing twist? Okay, probably not, but it's still fun to think about. The second point would be sure to disprove the fan theory that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 suggested in that Stan Lee was actually a Watcher. But it's easy to explain that. In that scene, we only saw Stan Lee telling the Watchers of all the things he saw. If this was a time-traveling Cap, it makes sense that the Watchers would take an interest in him and want to know what he's doing. This point would go further and talk about the remaining cameos that seem to disprove this theory and why those are actually in support of this theory instead. Of course, there's one big cameo that seems to suggest Stan Lee is someone else entirely in the MCU. Instead of being Steve Rogers, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 took a bold step in suggesting that Stan Lee's character was actually a part of the alien race known as the Watchers, who do, well, exactly as you expect them to do. They watch stuff. Apparently they don't have cable or access to streaming services because they spend all their free time observing and watching over the universe without ever interfering in anything. It was long theorized that Stan Lee was actually a Watcher in disguise, with some even pushing forward that he was in fact Uatu, who is probably the most famous of the Watchers. And although the second Guardians movie had everyone jumping to say that Stan Lee was a Watcher, go back and watch that scene again, and you'll see that it's still very possible that he is actually Steve Rogers. For one, isn't it a little strange that the movie kept Stan Lee's character as a human rather than just admitting he was a Watcher? The huge fan theory was that he was secretly part of the alien race, so why wouldn't they just make fans happy and see Stan Lee morph into a big blue Watcher? No. Instead, they made this clear that his character was human, hence the spacesuit, and that he was merely reporting to the Watchers rather than being one of them. He's listed online as the Watcher Informant, but isn't given a name. Why is that important? Well, let's play with a hypothetical situation. Let's say the Watchers, who in their decision to stay neutral and not interfere, suddenly got a blip on their cosmic radar. They found this man who had traveled back in time and stayed there, which would naturally alter the course of human history. Upon investigation, they find Steve Rogers, but don't know what to do with the guy. Steve, understanding the importance of keeping the timeline as normal as possible, agrees to not tamper or mess with events that would affect the future. And this would help with the other big problem in the whole Stan Lee is actually older Captain America theory. You may have noticed, but Stan Lee looks nothing like Chris Evans in old man makeup. And you would think that that would poke a huge hole the size of the Incredible Hulk in this theory, right? Wrong. I would argue that the Watchers agreed to let Steve monitor the events on Earth to make sure everything is okay, but they helped him have a disguise that would allow him to blend in and not be recognized. They give him the ability to morph into Stan Lee when he's around other people, which protects his identity and keeps the timeline fully intact. Does it sound a little crazy? Sure, but not as crazy as talking raccoons or trees that are best friends. It's the MCU, for Pete's sake. Anything's possible. Alright, have you wrapped your brain around the possibility of this theory yet? Because I am about to take it to an entirely other level. Let's get even crazier, folks. Stan Lee was known for having cameos in all the MCU films, but let's not forget, he also appeared in a lot of other Marvel movies. Now, it would be easy to write those off as non-canon, but with the concept of the multiverse promising to push the MCU into bold new directions, let's get a little nutty. I propose that every single Stan Lee cameo in a superhero movie is actually an old man Steve Rogers appearance. So, the hot dog vendor in the first X-Men movie, the headphones-wearing librarian in the Amazing Spider-Man, the security guard in the 2003 Hulk movie, the dog walker in Venom. All of them are Steve Rogers fulfilling his duty to make sure everything in the multiverse is functioning correctly. You know, after the whole Infinity Stone debacle. Let's even stretch this to animated movies like Big Hero 6 and Into the Spider-Verse. And if you really want to get wild, let's include all of his video game appearances too. If you get into this mindset, then you can picture Stan Lee being the bridge to connecting the Marvel multiverse. And when the multiverse concept fully takes off, it will be because of the work Stan Lee / Old Man Steve Rogers did in keeping everything together. I can think of no better way to honor the memory of Stan Lee than using his appearances as a way to unite the entire Marvel multiverse into one big, happy superhero family. Now, yes, again, I know how crazy this theory sounds, and it's not like we're ever going to get confirmation of this, you know, unless Disney Plus decides to make an animated old man Captain America show that sees a cartoon Stan Lee / Steve Rogers jumping around the multiverse and saving it from destruction, which, come on, it sounds awesome. But more than likely, this will probably just be a theory that lives on in our minds. And I don't know about you, but it will make me smile even more when I go back and rewatch a Marvel movie that has a Stan Lee cameo. Stan Lee will always be a legend, and no matter if his cameos are secretly hinting at something bigger or if it's really just a creator having fun in the movies based on his creations, I'm just happy his legacy will live on forever. Well, what do you think? Could Stan Lee actually be Old Man Cap? Let us know what you think of this theory, and obviously tell us what your favorite Stan Lee cameo is down in the comments below. And hit that subscribe button while you're at it for more awesome content. Thanks a lot for watching CBR. Excelsior!